Chapter 35. Pai Yü-ch'uan tastes too the lotus-leaf soup.
Huang Chin-ying skillfully plaits the plum-blossom-knotted nets.
Bao-Chiau had, our story goes, distinctly heard Lin Daiyu sneer, but in her eagerness to see her mother and brother, she did not so much as turn her head round, but continued straight on her way.
During this time, Lin Daiyu halted under the shadow of the trees.
Upon casting a glance in the distance towards the Huang Yuan, she observed Li Kengsai, Ying Chun, Tan Chun, Shi Chun and various inmates wending their steps in a body in the direction of the Huang court.
But after they had gone past, and company after company of them had dispersed, she only failed to see Lady Feng come.
How is it, she cogitated within herself, that she doesn't come to see Bao Yu? Even supposing that there was some business to detain her, she should also have put in an appearance, so as to curry favor with our venerable senior and Madame Wang. But if she hasn't shown herself at this hour of the day, there must certainly be some cause or other. While preoccupied with conjectures, she raised her head. At a second glance, she discerned a crowd of people, as thick as flowers in a bouquet, pursuing their way also into the Huang court. On looking fixedly, she recognized Dowager Lady Chia, leaning on Lady Feng's arm, followed by Madame Xing and Wang, Mrs. Xu and servant girls, married women and other domestics. In a body they walked into the court. At the sight of them, Daiyu unwittingly nodded her head, and reflected on the benefit of having a father and mother. And tears forthwith again bedewed her face. In a while, she beheld Bao-Chiau, Mrs. Xu and the rest likewise go in. But at quite an unexpected moment she became aware that Su-ch'uan was approaching her from behind.
"Miss," she said, "you had better go and take your medicine.
The hot water too has got cold. What do you, after all, mean by keeping on pressing me so?" inquired Daiyu. "Whether I have it or not, what's that to you?"
"Your cough," smiled Su-ch'uan, "has recently got a trifle better, and won't you again take your medicine?"
It's true. The 5th moon, and the weather is hot. But you should, nevertheless, take good care of yourself a bit. Here you've been at this early hour of the morning standing for ever so long in this damp place, so you should go back and have some rest. This single hint recalled Daiyu to her senses. She at length realized that her legs felt rather tired. After lingering about abstractedly for a long while, she quietly returned into the Shaoxiang lodge, supporting herself on Su-ch'uan. As soon as they stepped inside the entrance of the court, her gaze was attracted by the confused shadows of the bamboos, which covered the ground, and the traces of moss, here thick, there thin. And she could not help recalling to mind those 2 lines of the passage in the Shishang Qi. In that lone nook someone saunters about. White dew coldly bespecks the verdant moss. Shuang Wen, she consequently secretly communed within herself, as she sighed, had of course a poor fate. But she nevertheless had a widowed mother and a young brother. But in the unhappy destiny to which I, too, am at present doomed, I have neither a widowed mother nor a young brother. At this point in her reflections, she was about to melt into another fit of crying, when of a sudden, the parrot under the veranda caught sight of Daiyu approaching, and, with a shriek, he jumped down from his perch and made her start with fright. "Are you bent upon compassing your own death?" she exclaimed. "You've covered my head all over with dust again." The parrot flew back to his perch. "Shu Yan," he kept on shouting. "Quick, raise the portiere. Miss is come." Daiyu stopped short and rapped on the frame with her hand. "Have his food and water been replenished?" she asked. The parrot forthwith heaved a deep sigh, closely resembling in sound the groans usually indulged in by Daiyu, and then went on to recite. "Here I am fain these flowers to inter, but humankind will laugh me as a fool. Who knows who will in years to come commit me to my grave?" As soon as these lines fell on the ear of Daiyu and Su-ch'uan, they blurted out laughing. "This is what you were repeating some time back, miss." Su-ch'uan laughed. How did he ever manage to commit it to memory? Daiyu then directed someone to take down the frame and suspend it instead on a hook, outside the circular window. And presently entering her room, she seated herself inside the circular window. She had just done drinking her medicine, when she perceived that the shade cast by the cluster of bamboos, planted outside the window, was reflected so far on the gauze lattice as to fill the room with a faint light, so green and mellow, and to impart a certain coolness to the teapoys and mats. But Daiyu had no means at hand to dispel her ennui, so from inside the gauze lattice, she instigated the parrot to perform his pranks. And selecting some verses which had ever found favor with her, she tried to teach them to him. But without descending to particulars, let us now advert to Shu Paosi Chai. On her return home, she found her mother alone combing her hair and having a wash. "Why do you run over at this early hour of the morning?" she speedily inquired when she saw her enter.
"To see," replied Baochiau, "whether you were all right or not, mother."
"Did he come again, I wonder, after I left yesterday, and make any more trouble or not?"
As she spoke, she sat by her mother's side, but unable to curb her tears, she began to weep. Seeing her sobbing, Mrs. Shu herself could not check her feelings, and she, too, burst out into a fit of crying.
"My child," she simultaneously exhorted her, "don't feel aggrieved. Wait, and I'll call that child of wrath to order. For were anything to happen to you, from whom will I have anything to hope?" Shu Pian was outside and happened to overhear their conversation, so with alacrity he ran over, and facing Baochiau he made a bow,
Now to the left and now to the right, observing the while,
"My dear sister, forgive me this time. The fact is that I took some wine yesterday.
I came back late as I met a few friends on the way. On my return home, I hadn't as yet got over the fumes, so I unintentionally talked a lot of nonsense. But I don't so much as remember anything about all I said. It isn't worth your while, however, losing your temper over such a thing." Baochiau was in fact weeping as she covered her face, but the moment this language fell on her ear, she could scarcely again refrain from laughing. Forthwith raising her head, she sputtered contemptuously on the ground. "You can well dispense with all this sham," she exclaimed. "I'm well aware that you so dislike us both, that you're anxious to devise some way of inducing us to part company with you, so that you may be at liberty." Shu Pan at these words hastened to smile. "Sister," he argued, "what makes you say so? Once upon a time you weren't so suspicious and given to uttering anything so perverse." Mrs. Shu hurriedly took up the thread of the conversation. "All you know," she interposed, "is to find fault with your sister's remarks as being perverse. But can it be that what you said last night was the proper thing to say? In very truth, you were drunk." "There's no need for you to get angry, mother," Shu Pian rejoined, "nor for you, sister, either.
For from this day I shan't any more make common cause with them, nor drink wine or gad about. What do you say to that?"
"That's equal to an acknowledgement of your failings," Baochiau laughed. "Could you exercise such strength of will?" added Mrs. Shu. "Why, the dragon too would lay eggs." "If I again go and gad about with them," Shu Pian replied, "and you, sister, come to hear of it, you can freely spit in my face and call me a beast and no human being. Do you agree to that? But why should you two be daily worried?
"And all through me alone?"
For you, mother, to be angry on my account is anyhow excusable.
But for me to keep on worrying you, sister, makes me less than ever worthy of the name of a human being.
If now that father is no more, I manage instead of showing you plenty of filial piety, Mama, and you, sister, plenty of love to provoke my mother to anger and annoy my sister.
Why I can't compare myself to even a four-footed creature."
While from his mouth issued these words, tears rolled down from his eyes.
For he too found it hard to contain them. Mrs. Shu had not at first been overcome by her feelings. But the moment his utterances reached her ear, she once more began to experience the anguish, which they stirred in her heart. Baochiau made an effort to force a smile.
"You've already," she said, "been the cause of quite enough trouble, and do you now provoke mother to have another cry?" Hearing this, Shu Pan promptly checked his tears. As he put on a smiling expression, "When did I," he asked, "make mother cry? But never mind. Enough of this. Let's drop the matter and not allude to it anymore. Call Xiang Ling to come and give you a cup of tea, sister." "I don't want any tea," Baochiau answered. "I'll wait until mother has finished washing her hands and then go with her into the garden." "Let me see your necklet, sister," Shu Pian continued.
"I think it requires cleaning. It is so yellow and bright, rejoined Baochiau. And what's the use of cleaning it again?
Sister, proceeded Xueqin, you must now add a few more clothes to your wardrobe. So tell me what color and what design you like best. I haven't yet worn out all the clothes I have, Baochiau explained. And why should I have more made? But, in a little time, Mrs. Xu effected the change in her costume, and hand in hand with Baochiau, she started on her way to the garden. Xueqin thereupon took his departure. During this while, Mrs. Xu and Baochiau trudged in the direction of the garden to look up Baoyu.
As soon as they reached the interior of the Aiheng court, they saw a large concourse of waiting maids and matrons standing inside as well as outside the antechambers, and they readily concluded that old Lady Chia and the other ladies were assembled in his rooms. Mrs. Xu and her daughter stepped in.
After exchanging salutations with everyone present, they noticed that Baoyu was reclining on the couch, and Mrs. Xu inquired of him whether he felt any better. Baoyu hastily attempted to bow. I'm considerably better, he said. All I do, he went on, is to disturb you.
Aunt and you my cousin, but I don't deserve such attentions. Mrs. Xu lost no time in supporting and laying him down.
Mind you tell me whatever may take your fancy, she proceeded. If I do fancy anything, retorted Baoyu smilingly, I shall certainly send to you, Aunt, for it. What would you like to eat? Likewise inquired Madame Wang, so that I may on my return send it round to you.
There's nothing that I care for, smiled Baoyu. Though the soup made for me the other day with young lotus leaves and small lotus cores was, I thought, somewhat nice. From what I hear, its flavor is nothing very grand. Lady Feng chimed in laughingly, from where she stood on one side. It involves, however, a good deal of trouble to concoct.
And here you deliberately go and fancy this very thing. Go and get it ready, cried Dowager Lady Chia several successive times. Venerable ancestor, urged Lady Feng with a smile, don't you bother yourself about it.
Let me try and remember who can have put the molds away. Then turning her head round, go and bid, she enjoined an old matron. The chief in the cookhouse go and apply for them.
After a considerable lapse of time, the matron returned.
The chief in the cookhouse, she explained, says that the 4 sets of molds for soups have all been handed up. Upon hearing this, Lady Feng thought again for a while. Yes, I remember, she afterwards remarked. They were handed up, but I can't recollect to whom they were given. Possibly they're in the tea room. Thereupon she also dispatched a servant to go and inquire of the keeper of the tea room about them. But he too had not got them.
And it was subsequently the butler, entrusted with the care of the gold and silver articles, who brought them round.
Mrs. Xu was the first to take them and examine them. What, in fact, struck her gaze was a small box, the contents of which were 4 sets of silver molds. Each of these was over a foot long, and 1 square inch in breadth.
On the top, holes were bored of the size of beans. Some resembled chrysanthemums, others plum blossom. Some were in the shape of lotus seed cases, others like water chestnuts.
They numbered in all 30 or 40 kinds, and were ingeniously executed.
In your mansion, she felt impelled to observe smilingly to old Lady Chia and Madame Wang,
everything has been amply provided for. Have you got all these things to prepare a plate of soup with? Hadn't you told me, and I happened to see them, I wouldn't have been able to make out what they were intended for.
Lady Feng did not allow time to anyone to put in her word.
Aunt, she said, how could you ever have divined that these were used last year for the imperial viands? They thought of a way by which they devised, somehow or other, I can't tell how, some dough shapes, which borrow a little of the pure fragrance of the new lotus leaves. But as all mainly depends upon the quality of the soup, they're not, after all, of much use. Yet who often goes in for such soup? It was made once only, and that at the time when the molds were brought. And how is it that he has come to think of it today? So speaking, she took the molds and handed them to a married woman, to go and issue directions to the people in the cookhouse to procure at once several fowls, and to add other ingredients besides and prepare 10 bowls of soup. What do you want all that lot for?
Observe, Madame Wang.
There's good reason for it, answered Lady Feng. A dish of this kind isn't,
At ordinary times, very often made and were, now that brother Pao Yu has alluded to it, only sufficient prepared for him, and none for you. Dear Senior, you, Aunt and you, Madame Wang, it won't be quite the thing.
So isn't it better that this opportunity should be availed of to get ready a whole supply so that everyone should partake of some?
And that even I should, through my reliance on your kind favor, taste this novel kind of relish.
You are sharper than a monkey. Dowager Lady Chia laughingly exclaimed in reply to her proposal.
You make use of public money to confer boons upon people. This remark evoked general laughter. This is a mere bagatelle.
Eagerly laughed Lady Feng. Even I can afford to stand you such a small treat.
Then turning her head round, tell them in the cookhouse, she said to a married woman, to please make an extra supply, and that they'll get the money from me. The matron assented and went out of the room.
Baoyu, who was standing near, thereupon interposed with a smile. During the few years that have gone by since I've come here, I've carefully noticed that sister-in-law Sekunda cannot, with all her acumen, outwit our venerable ancestor.
My dear child,
Forthwith replied old Lady Chia at these words. I'm now quite an old woman, and how can there still remain any wit in me? When I was, long ago, of your manlike cousin Feng's age, I had far more wits about me than she has. Albeit she now avers that she can't reach our standard, she's good enough.
And compared with your Aunt Wang, why, she's infinitely superior.
Your aunt, poor thing, won't speak much. She's like a block of wood.
And when with her father and mother-in-law, she won't show herself off to advantage.
But that girl Feng has a sharp tongue. So is it a wonder if people take to her? From what you say,
insinuated Pao Yu with a smile. Those who don't talk much are not loved. Those who don't speak much, resumed Dowager Lady Chia, possess the endearing quality of reserve.
But among those with glib tongues, there's also a certain despicable lot. Thus it's better, in a word, not to have too much to say for oneself.
Quite so, smiled Pao Yu. Yet though senior sister-in-law Chia Chu doesn't,
I must confess, talk much, you, venerable ancestor, treat her just as you do cousin Feng. But if you maintain that those alone, who can talk, are worthy of love, then among all these young ladies, Sister Feng and cousin Lin are the only ones good enough to be loved.
With regard to the young ladies, remarked Dowager Lady Chia, it isn't that I have any wish to flatter your Aunt Shua in her presence,
but it is a positive and incontestable fact that there isn't, beginning from the 4 girls in our household, a single one able to hold a candle to that girl Baochiau. At these words, Mrs. Shu promptly smiled. Dear venerable senior, she said, you're rather partial in your verdict. Our dear senior,
vehemently put in Man Wang, also smiling, has often told me in private how nice your daughter Baochiau is. So this is no lie. Pao Ju had tried to lead old Lady Chia on, originally with the idea of inducing her to speak highly of Lin Daiyu. But when unawares she began to eulogize Baochiau, instead the result exceeded all his thoughts and went far beyond his expectations.
Forthwith he cast a glance at Baochiau and gave her a smile. But Baochiau at once twisted her head round and went and chatted with Shijin. But of a sudden, someone came to ask them to go and have their meal. Dowager Lady Chia rose to her feet and enjoined Po Yu to be careful of himself. She then gave a few directions to the waiting maids, and resting her weight on Lady Feng's arm, and pressing Mrs. Shu to go out first, she and all with her left the apartment in a body. But still she kept on inquiring whether the soup was ready or not. If there's anything you might fancy to eat, she also said to Mrs. Shu and the others, mind you, come and tell me, and I know how to coax that hussy Feng to get it for you as well as me.
My venerable senior, rejoined Mrs. Shu, you do have the happy knack of putting her on her mettle.
But though she has often got things ready for you, you've, after all, not eaten very much of them. Aunt? Smiled Lady Feng, don't make such statements. If our worthy senior hasn't eaten me up, it's purely and simply because she dislikes human flesh as being sour. Did she not look down upon it as sour, why, she would long ago have gobbled me up.
This joke was scarcely ended, when it so tickled the fancy of old Lady Chia and all the inmates that they broke out with one voice in a boisterous fit of laughter. Even Pao Yu, who was inside the room, could not keep quiet. Really, Shi Jin laughed. The mouth of our mistress Secunda is enough to terrify people to death. Baoyu put out his arm and pulled Shi Jin. You've been standing for so long, he smiled, that you must be feeling tired. Saying this, he dragged her down and made her take a seat next to him. Here you've again forgotten, laughingly exclaimed Shi Jin. Avail yourself now that Miss Baoxiao is in the court to tell her to kindly bid their Ying'er come and plait a few girdles with twisted cords. How lucky it is you've reminded me, Baoyu observed with a smile. And putting, while he spoke, his head out of the window. Cousin Baoxiao, he cried, when you've had your repast, do tell Ying'er to come over. I would like to ask her to plait a few girdles for me. Has she got the time to spare? Baoxiao heard him speak, and turning round, how about no time? She answered. I'll tell her by and by to come. It will be all right. Dowager Lady Chia and the others, however, failed to catch distinctly the drift of their talk, and they halted and made inquiries of Baoxiao what it was about. Baoxiao gave them the necessary explanations. My dear child, remarked old Lady Chia, do let her come and twist a few girdles for your cousin. And, should you be in need of anyone for anything, I have over at my place a whole number of servant girls doing nothing. Out of them, you are at liberty to send for any you like to wait on you. We'll send her to plait them. Mrs. Xu and Baoxiao observed smilingly with one consent. What can we want her for? She also daily idles her time away and is up to every mischief. But chatting the while, they were about to proceed on their way when they unexpectedly caught sight of Shang Yun, Ping Ura, Shang Lin and other girls picking balsam flowers near the rocks, who, as soon as they saw the company approaching, advanced to welcome them. Shortly, they all sallied out of the garden. Madame Wang was worrying lest Dowager Lady Chia's strength might be exhausted, and she did her utmost to induce her to enter the drawing room and sit down. Old Lady Chia herself was feeling her legs quite tired out, so she at once nodded her head and expressed her assent. Madame Wang then directed a waiting maid to hurriedly precede them and get ready the seats. But as Mrs. Chow had about this time pleaded indisposition, there was only therefore Mrs. Xu, with the matrons and servant girls at hand, so they had ample to do to raise the portieres, to put the back cushions in their places, and to spread out the rugs. Dowager Lady Chia stepped into the room, leaning on Lady Feng's arm. She and Mrs. Xu took their places, with due regard to the distinction between hostess and visitors. And Xu Baoxiao and Shi Shangyun seated themselves below. Madame Wang then came forward, and presented with her own hands tea to old Lady Chia, while Li Kengsai handed a cup to Mrs. Xu. You'd better let those young sisters-in-law do the honors, remonstrated old Lady Chia, and sit over there so that we may be able to have a chat. Madame Wang at length sat on a small bench. Let our worthy seniors' viands, she cried, addressing herself to Lady Feng, be served here, and let a few more things be brought. Lady Feng acquiesced without delay, and she told a servant to cross over to their old mistress' quarters and to bid the matrons, employed in that part of the household, promptly go out and summon the waiting girls. The various waiting maids arrived with all dispatch. Madame Wang directed them to ask their young ladies round. But after a protracted absence on the errand, only 2 of the girls turned up, Tanxi Jian and Shi Chun. Ying Chun was not in her state of health, equal to the fatigue, or able to put anything in her mouth, and Lin Daiyu, superfluous to add, could only safely partake of 5 out of 10 meals, so no one thought anything of their non-appearance. Presently the eatables were brought, and the servants arranged them in their proper places on the table. Lady Feng took a napkin and wrapped a bundle of chopsticks in it. Venerable ancestor and you, Mrs. Xu, she smiled, standing the while below. There's no need of any yielding. Just you listen to me and I'll make things all right. Let's do as she wills. Old Lady Chia remarked to Mrs. Xu laughingly. Mrs. Xu signified her approval with a smile. So Lady Feng placed in due course 4 pairs of chopsticks on the table. The 2 pairs on the upper end for Dowager Lady Chia and Mrs. Xu. Those on the 2 sides for Xu Baoxiao and Shi Shangyun. Madame Wang, Li Kengsai, and a few others stood together below and watched the attendants serve the viands. Lady Feng first and foremost hastily asked for clean utensils and drew near the table to select some eatables for Baoyu. Presently, the soup a la lotus leaves arrived. After old lady Chia had well scrutinized it, Madame Wang turned her head, and catching sight of Yu-ch'uan, she immediately commissioned her to take some over to Pai Yü. She can't carry it single-handed, demurred Lady Feng. But by a strange coincidence, Ying then walked into the room along with Shi-er, and Bao-Chiau, knowing very well that they had already had their meal, forthwith said to Ying, "Your master Secundus, Mr. Baoyu, just asked that you should go and twist a few girdles for him. So you two might as well proceed together." Ying expressed her readiness and left the apartment in company with Yu-ch'uan. "How can you carry it, so very hot as it is, the whole way there?" observed Ying. "Don't distress yourself," rejoined Yu-ch'uan, smiling. "I know how to do it." Saying this, she directed a matron to come and place the soup, rice, and the rest of the eatables in a present box, and bidding her lay hold of it and follow them, the two girls sped on their way with empty hands and made straight for the entrance of the I-hung court. Here Yu-ch'uan at length took the things herself and entered the room in company with Ying. The trio, Shijin, Shiyu, and Chiu-wen, were at the time chatting and laughing with Pao. But the moment they saw their two friends arrive, they speedily jumped to their feet. "How is it," they exclaimed laughingly, "that you two drop in just the nick of time? Have you come together?" With these words on their lips, they descended to greet them. Yu-ch'uan took at once a seat on a small stool. Ying, however, did not presume to seat herself, and though Shijin was quick enough in moving a footstool for her, Ying did not still venture to sit down. Ying-er's arrival filled Pao Yu with intense delight. But as soon as he noticed Yu-ch'uan, he recalled to memory her sister Qin-chuan, and he felt wounded to the very heart and overpowered with shame. And without troubling his mind about Ying, he addressed his remarks to Yu-ch'uan. Shijin saw very well that Ying had failed to attract his attention, and she began to fear lest she felt uncomfortable. And when she further realized that Ying herself would not take a seat, she drew her out of the room and repaired with her into the outer apartment, where they had a chat over their tea. Shiyu and her companions had, in the meantime, got the bowls and chopsticks ready and came to wait upon Pao Gu during his meal. But Pao Wu would not have anything to eat. "Is your mother all right?" he forthwith inquired of Yu-ch'uan. An angry scowl crept over Yu-ch'uan. She did not even look straight at Pao Yu, and only after a long pause was it that she at last uttered merely the words, "All right," by way of reply. Pao Yu, therefore, found talking to her of little zest. But after a protracted silence he felt impelled to again force a smile and to ask, "Who told you to bring these things over to me?" "The ladies," answered Yu-ch'uan. Pao Yu discerned the mournful expression, which still beclouded her countenance, and he readily jumped at the conclusion that it must be entirely occasioned by the fate which had befallen Qin-chuan. But when fain to put on a meek and unassuming manner and endeavor to cheer her, he saw how little he could demean himself in the presence of so many people, and consequently he did his best and discovered the means of getting everyone out of the way. Afterwards, straining another smile, he plied her with all sorts of questions. Yu-ch'uan, it is true, did not at first choose to heed his advances, yet when she observed that Pao Yu did not put on any airs, and that in spite of all her querulous reproaches, he still continued pleasant and agreeable, she felt disconcerted, and her features at last assumed a certain expression of cheerfulness. Pao Yu thereupon smiled. "My dear girl," he said, as he gave way to entreaties, "bring that soup and let me taste it." "I've never been in the habit of feeding people," Yu-ch'uan replied. "You'd better wait till the others return." "You can have some then." "I don't want you to feed me," laughed Pao Yu. "It's because I can't move about that I appeal to you. Do let me have it. You'll then get back early and be able, when you've handed over the things, to have your meal. But were I to go on wasting your time, won't you feel upset from hunger? Should you be lazy to budge, well then, I'll endure the pain and get down and fetch it myself." As he spoke, he tried to alight from bed. He strained every nerve and raised himself, but unable to stand the exertion, he burst out into groans. At the sight of his anguish, Yu-ch'uan had not the heart to refuse her help,
Springing up, "Lie down," she cried. "In what former existence did you commit such evil that your retribution in the present one is so apparent? Which of my eyes, however, can brook looking at you going on in that way?"
While taunting him, she again blurted out laughing and brought the soup over to him. "My dear girl," smiled Pao Yu, "if you want to show temper, better do so here. When you see our venerable senior and Madame my mother, you should be a little more even-tempered, for if you still behave like this, you'll at once get a scolding." Eat away, urged Yu Xie. "There's no need for you to be so sweet-mouthed and honey-tongued with me. I don't put any faith in such talk." So speaking, she pressed Pao Yu until he had 2 mouthfuls of soup. It isn't nice, Pao Yu purposely exclaimed. "Amida fu," ejaculated Yu Xie. "If this isn't nice, what's nice?" "There's no flavor about it at all," resumed Pao Yu. "If you don't believe me, taste it and you'll find out for yourself." Yu-ch'uan, in a tantrum, actually put some of it to her lips. "Well," laughed Pao Yu, "it is nice." This exclamation eventually enabled Yu-chen to see what Pao Yu was driving at, for Pao Yu had in fact been trying to beguile her to have a mouthful. As, at one moment, you say you don't want any, she forthwith observed, "And now you say it is nice. I won't give you any." While Pao Yu returned her smiles, he kept on earnestly entreating her to let him have some. Yu-ch'uan, however, would still not give him any. And she, at the same time, called to the servants to fetch what there was for him to eat.
But the instant the waiting maid put her foot into the room, servants came quite unexpectedly to deliver a message.
2 nurses, they said, have arrived from the household of Mr. Fu Secundus to present his compliments.
They have now come to see you, Mr. Secundus. As soon as Pao Yu heard this report, he felt sure that they must be nurses sent over from the household of Deputy Sub-Prefect Fu Shi. This Fu Shi had originally been a pupil of Chia Cheng, and had, indeed, had to rely entirely upon the reputation enjoyed by the Chia family for the realization of his wishes. Chia Cheng had likewise treated him with such genuine regard, and so unlike any of his other pupils, that he, Fu Shi, ever and anon dispatched inmates from his mansion to come and see him so as to keep up friendly relations.
Pao Hu had at all times entertained an aversion for bold-faced men and unsophisticated women. So why did he once more, on this occasion, issue directions that the 2 matrons should be introduced into his presence?
There was, in fact, a reason for his action.
It was simply that Pao Yu had come to learn that Fu Shi had a sister, Chu Fang by name, a girl as comely as a magnificent gem, and perfection itself, the report of outside people went, as much in intellect as in beauty. He had, it is true, not yet seen anything of her with his own eyes, but the sentiments which made him think of her and cherish her, from a distance, were characterized by such extreme sincerity that, dreading lest he should, by refusing to admit the matrons, reflect discredit upon Fu Chu Fang, he was prompted to lose no time in expressing a wish that they should be ushered in. This Fu Shi had really risen from the vulgar herd. So, seeing that Chu Fang possessed several traits of beauty and exceptional intellectual talents, Fu Shi arrived at the resolution of making his sister the means of joining relationship with the influential family of some honorable clan. And so unwilling was he to promise her lightly to any suitor that things were delayed up to this time. Therefore Fu Chu Fang, though at present past her 20th birthday, was not as yet engaged. But the various well-to-do families, belonging to honorable clans, looked down, on the other hand,
on her poor and mean extraction, holding her in such light esteem, as not to relish the idea of making any offer for her hand. So if Fu Shi cultivated intimate terms with the Chia household, he, needless to add, did so with an interested motive.
The 2 matrons, deputed on the present errand, completely lacked, as it happened, all knowledge of the world, and the moment they heard that Pao Yu wished to see them, they wended their steps inside. But no sooner had they inquired how he was, and passed a few remarks than Yu Shongor, becoming conscious of the arrival of strangers, did not bandy words with Pao Yu, but stood with the plate of soup in her hands, engrossed in listening to the conversation.
Pao Yu was absorbed in speaking to the matrons, and, while eating some rice, he stretched out his arm to get at the soup. But both his and her, Yu-ch'uan were riveted on the women, and as he thoughtlessly jerked out his hand with some violence, he struck the bowl and turned it clean over. The soup fell over Pao Yu's hand. But it did not hurt Yu Xian'er. She sustained, however, such a fright that she gave a start. "How did this happen?" she smilingly shouted with vehemence to the intense consternation of the waiting maids, who rushed up and clasped the bowl. But notwithstanding that Pao Yu had scalded his own hand, he was quite unconscious of the accident. So much so that he assailed Yu-ch'uan with a heap of questions as to where she had been burnt, and whether it was sore or not. Yu-ch'uan and everyone present were highly amused. "You yourself," observed Yu-ch'uan, "have been scalded, and do you keep on asking about myself?" At these words, Pao Du became at last aware of the injury he had received. The servants rushed with all promptitude and cleared the mess. But Pao Du was not inclined to touch any more food. He washed his hands, drank a cup of tea, and then exchanged a few further sentences with the two matrons. But subsequently, the two women said goodbye and quitted the room. Qing Wen and some other girls saw them as far as the bridge, after which they retraced their steps. The two matrons perceived that there was no one about, and while proceeding on their way, they started a conversation. "It isn't strange," smiled the one, "if people say that this Pao Yu of theirs is handsome in appearance, but stupid as far as brains go."
Nice enough a thing to look at, but not to put to one's lips. Rather idiotic, in fact. For he burns his own hand and then he asks someone else whether she's sore or not.
"Now isn't this being a regular fool?" "The last time I came," the other remarked, also smiling, "I heard that many inmates of his family feel ill will against him. In real truth, he is a fool. For there he drips in the heavy downpour like a waterfowl, and instead of running to shelter himself, he reminds other people of the rain and urges them to get quick out of the wet. Now tell me, isn't this ridiculous, eh?" Time and again, when no one is present, he cries to himself, then laughs to himself. When he sees a swallow, he instantly talks to it. When he espies a fish in the river, he forthwith speaks to it.
At the sight of stars or the moon, if he doesn't groan and sigh, he mutters and mutters.
Indeed, he hasn't the least bit of character. So much so that he even puts up with the temper shown by those low-bred maids.
If he takes a fancy to a thing, it's nice enough even though it be a bit of thread. But as for waste, what does he mind? A thing may be worth 1,000 or 10,000 pieces of money.
He doesn't worry his mind in the least about it. While they talked, they reached the exterior of the garden, and they betook themselves back to their home, where we will leave them. As soon as Shijin, for we will return to her, saw the women leave the room, she took Ying Erhai by the hand and led her in, and they asked Pao Yu what kind of girdle he wanted made.
"I was just now so bent upon talking," Pao smiled to Ying "that I forgot all about you.
I put you to the trouble of coming, not for anything else, but that you should also make me a few nets." "Nets? To put what in?" Ying inquired. Pao Yu, at this question, put on a smile. "Don't concern yourself about what they are for," he replied. "Just make me a few of each kind." Ying clapped her hand and laughed. "Could this ever be done?" she cried. "If you want all that lot, why, they couldn't be finished in 10 years' time."
"My dear girl,"
smiled Pao Yu, "work at them for me then whenever you are at leisure, and have nothing better to do. How could you get through them all in a little time?" Shijin interposed smilingly. "First choose now therefore such as are most urgently needed and make a couple of them." "What about urgently needed?" Ying exclaimed, "They are merely used for fans, scented pendants and handkerchiefs. Nets for handkerchiefs will do all right." Pao Yu answered. "What's the color of your handkerchief?" inquired Ying her. "It's a deep red one," Pao Yu rejoined. "For a deep red one," continued Ying "a black net will do very nicely, or one of dark green. Both these agree with the color." "What goes well with brown?" Pao Yu asked.
"Peach red goes well with brown,"
Ying added. "That will make them look gaudy," Pao Yu observed. "Yet with all their plainness, they should be somewhat gaudy." "Leek green and willow yellow are what are most to my taste," Ying pursued. "Yes, they'll also do," Pao Yu retorted.
But make one of peach red too, and then one of leek green.
Of what design? Ara remarked.
How many kinds of designs are there? Baoyu said.
There are the stick of incense, stools upset towards heaven, part of elephant's eyes, squares, chains,
Plum blossom and willow leaves, Ying-er answered. What was the kind of design you made for Miss Tertia the other day? Baoyu inquired. It was the plum blossom with piled cores, Ying-er explained in reply. Yes, that's nice, Baoyu rejoined.
As he uttered this remark, Shijin arrived with the cords.
But no sooner were they brought than a matron cried, from outside the window. Girls, your viands are ready. Go and have your meal, urged Baoyu, and come back quick after you've had it. There are visitors here, Shijin smiled. And how can I very well go? What makes you say so?
Barhar laughed while adjusting the cords.
It's only right and proper that you should go and have your food at once and then return. Hearing this, Shijin and her companions went off, leaving behind only 2 youthful servant girls to answer the calls. Baoyu watched Ying-er make the nets.
But, while keeping his eyes intent on her, he talked at the same time of one thing and then another, and next went on to ask her how far she was in her teens. Ying-er had continued plaiting.
I'm 16, she simultaneously rejoined. What was your original surname? Baoyu added. It was Huang, answered Ying-er.
That's just the thing,
Baoyu smiled. For in real truth there's the Wang Ying-er. Oriole. My name at one time consisted of 2 characters, continued Ying-er. I was called Chin-ying. But Miss Baochiau didn't like it, as it was difficult to pronounce and only called me Ying-er. So now I've come to be known under that name. One can very well say that Cousin Baochiau is fond of you. Baoyu pursued. By and by, when she gets married, she's sure to take you along with her. Ying-er puckered up her lips and gave a significant smile. I've often told Shijin, Baoyu smiled, that I can't help wondering who'll shortly be the lucky ones to win your mistress and yourself. You aren't aware, laughed Ying-er, that our young mistress possesses several qualities not to be found in a single person in this world. Her face is a second consideration. Baoyu noticed how captivating Ying-er's tone of voice was, how complacent she was, and how simpleton-like unaffected in her language and smiles. And he soon felt the warmest affection for her.
And particularly so when she started the conversation about Baochiau. Where do her qualities lie?
He readily inquired. My dear girl, please tell me.
If I tell you, said Ying-er, you must, on no account, let her know anything about it again.
This goes without saying, smiled Baoyu.
But this answer was still on his lips, when they overheard someone outside remark, how is it that everything is so quiet? Both gazed round to see who possibly it could be. They discovered, strange enough, no one else than Baochiau herself.
Baoyu hastily offered her a seat. Baochiau seated herself, and then wanted to know what Ying-er was busy plaiting. Inquiring the while, she approached her and scrutinized what she held in her hands, half of which had by this time been done. What's the fun of a thing like this? She said. Wouldn't it be preferable to plait a net, and put the jade in it? This allusion suggested the idea to Baoyu. Speedily clapping his hands, he smiled and exclaimed, Your idea is splendid, cousin.
I'd forgotten all about it. The only thing is what color will suit it best.
It will never do to use mixed colors, Baochiau rejoined. Deep red will, on one hand, clash with the color, while yellow is not pleasing to the eye.
And black, on the other hand, is too somber. But wait, I'll try and devise something. Bring that gold cord and use it with the black beaded cord. And if you twist one of each together and make a net with them, it will look very pretty.
Upon hearing this, Baoyu was immeasurably delighted, and time after time he shouted to the servants to fetch the gold cord. But just at that moment Shijin stepped in with 2 bowls of eatables. How very strange this is today, she said to Baoyu. Why, a few minutes back, my mistress, your mother, sent someone to bring me 2 bowls of viands. The supply, replied Baoyu smiling, must have been so plentiful today that they've sent some to every one of you. It isn't that, continued Shijin, for they were distinctly given to me by name.
What's more, I wasn't bidden go and knock my head.
So this is indeed remarkable.
If they're given to you, Baoyu smiled, why, you had better go and eat them.
What's there in this to fill you with conjectures?
There's never been anything like this before, Shijin added. So it makes me feel uneasy. Baoxiai compressed her lips. If this, she laughed, makes you feel uneasy, there will be by and by other things to make you far more uneasy. Shijin realized that she implied something by her insinuations, as she knew from past experience that Baoxiai was not one given to lightly and contemptuously poking fun at people. And remembering the notions entertained by Madame Wang on the last occasion she had seen her, she dropped at once any further allusions to the subject and brought the eatables up to Baoyu for his inspection. I shall come and hold the cords, she observed, as soon as I've rinsed my hands. This said, she immediately quitted the apartment. After her meal, she washed her hands and came inside to hold the gold cords for Ying Er to plait the net with. By this time, Baoxiai had been called away by a servant, dispatched by Xu Pian. But while Baoyu was watching the net that was being made, he caught sight, at a moment least expected, of two servant girls, who came from the part of Madame Xing of the other mansion, to bring him a few kinds of fruits, and to inquire whether he was able to walk. If you can go about, they told him. Our mistress desires you, Mr. Baoyu, to cross over tomorrow and have a little distraction. Her ladyship really longs to see you. Were I able to walk, Baoyu answered with alacrity, I would feel it my duty to go and pay my respects to your mistress. Anyhow, the pain is better than before. So request your lady to allay her solicitude. As he bade them both sit down, he at the same time called Chu Wen. Take, he said to her, half of the fruits just received, to Miss Lin as a present. Chu Wen signified her obedience, and was about to start on her errand, when she heard Daiyu talking in the court, and Baoyu eagerly shout out, request her to walk in at once. But should there be any further particulars, which you, reader, might feel disposed to know, peruse the details given in the following chapter.
Thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more excellent content.